but I won't do that. You know, it was October 1st of 2017 when a lone gunman shot and killed 59 people and sent another 32 to the hospital in Las Vegas at a country music festival. I wonder if it wasn't one of those moments for some of us where you remember where you were when you heard that. You know, as the days would pass, though, the victims started to come to grips with what had just taken place. And as often happens after a tragedy, you began to hear these selfless stories of people who heroically put their lives on the line to help, in some cases, complete strangers. One of those stories that was told was of a 53-year-old Philadelphia financial planner who threw himself on top of a younger couple who was dating, who had ducked down to avoid the bullets that were flying over their heads. And when he was asked why he did it, he said, "Because I'm 53 and because they were obviously in their 20s, and I've lived a good life, and I'd rather them live longer than me." Well, you know, today we're looking at somebody that Hebrews 11 defines as a hero of the faith. And at first glance, you might just struggle with that definition if you know his story. Because Samson, well, he was far from selfless, and he never would have done what that Philadelphia financial planner did. In fact, Samson, he was selfish. He was always looking out for number one, and he'd been like that ever since his life had began. You know, so often when we remember the story of Samson, we remember the Sunday school lessons, don't we? We remember this strange guy who God told never to cut his hair, and so long as he didn't, that he would have this superhuman strength. Well, understand that the story that you heard in Sunday school was likely the G-rated version. But in reality, if the true story of Samson as told in the Old Testament book of Judges, if it were ever made into a movie, it would likely come with a disturbing violence warning, with an extreme language warning, and with a definite cruelty to animals warning. Because that's just who Samson was. And yet there's something about his character and his story that God says is worthy of him being part of this incredible list in Hebrews chapter 11. We're told in Hebrews 11, starting at verse 32, and referring to Samson's life, it says, "And what more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, who through faith were made strong out of weakness." And that is such an incredibly true statement about his life. And he is a hero, but his journey into that status was filled with mistake after mistake after mistake. And yet God had a plan for him. And this morning we're going to unpack his story together. From the beginning of his life to the end, from his birth to his death, from his promising future to his disgraceful demise. And his entire life is encompassed into just 4 chapters of the book of Judges. And in these chapters, we're introduced to this incredibly complex character. And as we're going to find out, at this point in Israel's history, he was Israel's only hope for deliverance from their oppressors. And I think when we're finished this morning, you're likely going to be questioning whether he actually should have been in this passage in Hebrews. You're going to question whether he truly did have an unshakable faith, whether he really fits into our nice, neat, defined package of what somebody with an unshakable faith looks like. But before we jump into his story, I want us to go back and I want to remind you of something that we talked about a couple of weeks ago when we talked about Gideon, and then last week when we talked about Barak. Because both of those stories were talked about in the book of Judges. And the book of Judges, as we shared, was a book about the nation of Israel's cycles. And a typical cycle for the nation of Israel consisted of disobedience to God, God allowing an outside group to come in and oppress them, and then deliverance from their oppressors. And all throughout the book of Judges, as we talked about, this cycle repeats itself 7 different times. And the story of Samson occurs in the 7th and final recorded cycle. And in chapter 13, verse 1, we hear this again, as we've already heard 6 times in the book of Judges. We hear this again. And the people of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. So the Lord gave them into the hand of the Philistines for 40 years. So the Philistines were this wicked and immoral group of people. They'd originally come out of Egypt and were told that they oppressed Israel for 40 years. Just think about that, for 4 decades. And the Philistines weren't simply another small Canaanite tribe, but they were this formidable civilization that occupied the coastal plain of Canaan. And their famous cities included Gaza and Ashkelon and Ashdod and Ekron and Gath, 5 major cities, 5 political centers, and 5 places from which Philistine power radiated throughout that entire region. Archaeology has uncovered evidence of these sophisticated architectural buildings, of these sophisticated weapons, and a very well-organized military. And the Philistines had the technological advantage as well. In other words, Israel wasn't simply oppressed politically, but they were outmatched technologically as well. The Philistines had a military advantage. They had an economic advantage. They had a strategic advantage. And Israel, for 40 years, had just gotten used to living in their shadow. But what we're about to find out is that God is going to give them a new deliverer. And yes, he was going to give them Samson. And Samson's life had a divinely ordained purpose, really right from the very beginning. We find out what is next in the next verses of chapter 13. We find out in that chapter that there was a devout Jewish man by the name of Manoah, and he and his wife couldn't have kids. In fact, we're told that his wife was barren, but one night an angel of the Lord came to her, and this is what he said. He said, "Behold, you are barren and have not borne children, but you shall conceive and bear a son." So even Samson's birth had this miraculous component to it. The angel continues in verse 4 and says, "Therefore be careful and drink no wine or strong drink, and eat nothing unclean. For behold, you shall conceive and bear a son. No razor shall come upon his head, for the child shall be a Nazarite to God from the womb." And then the angel drops what must have felt like a bomb on this family when he says, "And he shall begin to save Israel from the hand of the Philistines." The book of Numbers describes what it means to be a Nazarite. And there were really 3 different components to that, 3 different components of the Nazarite vow, or 3 commitments that a Nazarite must keep during the period of that vow. The first thing they needed to do was to avoid contact with grapes, vineyards, and the drinking of wine. The second is that they were never to touch a dead body or a carcass of any kind, that being human or of an animal. And the third thing is that they were never to cut their hair. And at its core, the Nazarite vow was a vow of separation, a vow of complete and total commitment to God. The angel went on to tell his parents that Samson's vow was to be this living example of God's presence to the nation of Israel. And even his name was significant because the name Samson comes from the Hebrew word shimshon, meaning strong or one with extra strength. So Samson's mission in life was to be this instrument of God's deliverance, and his sole purpose to why he was created was to deliver the nation of Israel from the hand of the Philistines. And chapter 13, verse 24 in the ESV tells us this. And the woman bore a son and called his name Samson. And the young man grew, and the Lord blessed him. The NIV puts it this way. It translates the latter part of that verse as, the Spirit of the Lord began to stir him. And as we're about to discover, he was set apart by God for this very specific task. And he would be given this extraordinary strength as a tool specifically to help him in defeating the Philistines. But if you're familiar with this story, that you know as we move our way into Judges chapter 4, we find a much more grown-up Samson who seems to be making more and more mistakes. His first big mistake was heading to the wrong place. In fact, in verse 1, we're told that Samson went down to Timnah. Now, you might be sitting there asking, well, what's the big deal about that? But the writer is telling us two things in this little phrase. Firstly, Timnah was in Philistine territory, actually about 4 miles from the village that Samson lived in. And it was a forbidden place for the Israelites to go. In fact, his presence there was forbidden by the Jewish law. But this verse also tells us something about the decline in Samson's walk with God. Because in this, his first public act, he leaves the land of Israel for the land of the Philistines because he thinks that the grass is greener over there. Which leads us to mistake number 2, and that is that he was looking for the wrong thing. Notice the rest of verse 1. It says, Samson went down to Timnah and saw one of the daughters of the Philistines. Then he came up and told his father and mother, I saw one of the daughters of the Philistines at Timnah. Now get her for me as my wife. So Samson sees this Philistine woman and he says to his parents, now get her for me as my wife. Or I like the way that the NIV translates that. It says, now get her for me because she is right in my eyes. And that little phrase is loaded with meaning. The Hebrew phrase or expression is essentially benelai, and that means in my eyes. In other words, Samson is saying, this looks right to me. I want this. This is what I have decided that I need. And there's an important distinction here because Samson's not asking whether the woman is right in God's eyes. He's asking, or he's saying, and telling his parents that she is right in his eyes. And that really is the beginning of his downward spiral. And I really don't think that's much different from how it works with us too, isn't it? Maybe we say some of those same things. Maybe we say, it feels right. It makes me happy. I don't see anything wrong with it. This is what I want. But you know, Scripture repeatedly reminds us that our eyes are not always a reliable moral compass. You know, I think about Proverbs 14:12 that reminds us that there's a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way to death. Samson likely knows that this puts his parents in a very, very difficult spot, because they know that it was strictly forbidden by God for them to even associate with the Philistines. And yet here he is, this great deliverer of the nation of Israel, wanting to do more than just party with them, but he wants to marry one of them. So Samson, he was looking in the wrong place. He was looking for the wrong thing. And he was there for the wrong reason. The third mistake is that he rejects his parents' godly counsel. His parents, they emphatically try and talk him out of making this mistake. And they say to him in verse 3, "Is there not a woman among the daughters of your relatives or among all our people that you must take a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines?" But Samson again says to his father, "Get her for me, for she is right in my eyes." So his parents try and warn him about the mistake that he's about to make. But Samson doesn't want to hear it, and he blows off their advice. And the mistakes continue. The fourth mistake he makes is that he violates his Nazirite commitment. And as the story is unpacked, well, Samson is traveling with his parents, apparently making some wedding arrangements along the way. He goes into a vineyard, which, if you remember, was strictly forbidden by his Nazirite vow. And there he encounters this young lion. And I don't know if you heard the story. It was a couple years ago now about the man from Pakistan who was on a safari, and he had this terrifying encounter with this lion. And as he was running away, he turned his camera around and he snapped this picture. Terrifying, isn't it? And I don't know what would be running through your head if that thing started to chase you. How terrifying would that be? But Samson, he wasn't afraid in this encounter. In fact, this is what we're told happens in verse 6 of chapter 14. Then the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him. And although he had nothing in his hand, he tore the lion in pieces as one tears a young goat. But he did not tell his father or his mother what he had done. So we're told that his superhuman strength was actually the Spirit of the Lord coming on him, likely giving him the strength to protect himself. And he literally tears this lion apart with his bare hands. I find it kind of interesting in this passage that we're also told that he didn't tell his father or his mother what he had done. I mean, you would think that a son would be proud to tell his father something like that, wouldn't you? But he doesn't tell them. Firstly, because he was in a vineyard, which he knew was against his sworn vow. But secondly, because by killing the lion, it meant that he had to touch the dead corpse, which was yet another violation of his Nazirite vow. And according to the Jewish law, Samson has now become ceremonially unclean for breaking his vow. And if that's not bad enough, he does it again in verse 9. This time, Samson is traveling alone and stops by the same vineyard. And this is what we're told, starting in verse 8. After some time, he returned to take her. So we can assume by that this is close to his wedding day. And he was walking by the same vineyard. And he turned aside to see the carcass of the lion, obviously the one that he killed. And behold, there was a swarm of bees in the body of the lion and honey. And he scraped it out into his hands and went on eating as he went. And he came to his father and mother and gave some to them. And they ate. But again, here's that phrase, but he did not tell them that he had scraped the honey from the carcass of the lion. Because he knew that once again he had broken the vow that he had made by coming into contact with that dead animal. He breaks his vow again in verse 10, and in keeping with the Palestine wedding traditions, he threw a huge bachelor party. And the word used in the Hebrew to describe this party implies that there was an awful lot of drinking that was going on there. And yet again, he violates his Nazirite vow and gets drunk. At this point, the only one of his vows that he hasn't broken was his hair, right? Well, his fifth mistake was that he started to believe that he was invincible. He thought that he was Superman and that he had no kryptonite. And we pick up the story in verse 11, and on day one of the 7-day wedding feast, Samson, we find, is partying with his 30 Philistine groomsmen, and he offers them this riddle, and he tells them that if they can figure out by the end of the week what the riddle means, that he's going to buy them some new clothes. The riddle involved the honey that Samson took from the carcass of the lion, and for the sake of time, I'm not going to tell you the details of the riddle. But for 3 days, these groomsmen tried to figure out what this riddle meant. And apparently, these must have been some great clothes they were trying to win, because these groomsmen would do anything to get them. We're told in verse 15 that on the 4th day, after not being able to figure out the riddle, they said to Samson's wife, "Entice your husband to tell us what the riddle is, lest we burn you and your father's house with fire." And all of a sudden, you get the sense that this was no friendly game of wits anymore. As you can imagine, Samson's wife-to-be was terrified, and we're told that she went to Samson and threw herself at him, sobbing, and said, "You hate me. You do not love me. You've put a riddle to my people, and you've not even told me what it is." Well, he eventually tells her, and after 7 days of pleading, and when she finally finds out the answer to the riddle, she tells the groomsmen. And you would think, end of the joke, right? Well, not even close. And Samson's 6th mistake was that he couldn't control his anger. When Samson found out what had happened, he was embarrassed and he was furious. We're told that he was so angry that he went to a nearby town, and starting in verse 19, it says, he struck down 30 men of the town and took their spoil and gave the garments to those who had told the riddle. In hot anger, he went back to his father's house, and Samson's wife was given to his companion, who had been his best man. So having lost this bet, Samson finds 30 men. He murders them, again needing to touch their dead bodies in order to get their clothes off, and again violates the Nazirite vow. And his feelings of love and romance are now replaced with rage and revenge, and as a result, he leaves his bride standing at the altar. And chapter 14 ends with her father giving her in marriage to, of all people, his best man. We find another example of his anger in verse 15, and as this scene opens, Samson decides that he wants his wife back. You know, a few months have passed, and Samson takes this young goat as a gift for his ex, and we're told that after some days, at the time of the wheat harvest, Samson went to visit his wife, or his ex-wife, with the young goat. And he said, "I will go in to my wife's room and into her chamber." But her father would not allow him to go in. And her father said, "I really thought you utterly hated her, so I gave her to your companion." And Samson he's burning with anger. And in verse 3 says, "This time I have a right to get even with the Philistines. I will really harm them." So we're told that Samson goes out and catches 300 foxes, ties them tail to tail in pairs. Now just try and visualize that. I've tried and I'm struggling. And it's likely a lot harder than it sounds. And you probably shouldn't try that at home, kids. But once he has the tails tied together, he fastens this torch to them and he lets them loose in the fields. And verse 5 says that they burned up the shocks. And that's significant, because that's referring to the wheat that had already been cut in the standing grain, the vineyards, and the olive groves. And it's significant because the Philistines only had 3 cash crops. It was wheat, it was olives, and it was grapes. And here is Samson single-handedly destroying the economic base of this entire area with these flaming foxes. But he's not finished yet. There were consequences to this. And in verse 6 we read, the Philistines were so mad that they burned Samson's wife and her father. And again, Samson was furious. Verse 7 says this, and Samson said to them, if this is what you do, I swear I will be avenged on you. And after that, I will quit. And he struck them hip and thigh with a great blow, and he went down and stayed in the cleft of the rock of Edom. Now keep in mind that all of this at this time was happening on Philistine land. And we're told that they sent this large contingency to go and arrest Samson in this cave, which was part of the land that the Israelites were staying on. And verse 10 says this, it says, and the men of Judah said, why have you come up against us? We've come up to bind Samson to do to him as he did to us. Then 3,000 men of Judah went down to the cleft of the rock and said to Samson, do you not know that the Philistines are rulers over us? What then is this that you have done to us? And he said to them, as they did to me, so I have done to them. And they said to him, we have come down to bind you, that we may give you into the hands of the Philistines. Samson said to them, swear to me that you will not attack me yourselves. And they said to him, no, we will only bind you and give you into their hands. We will surely not kill you. So this agreement is struck. And they bind him with these 2 new ropes, and they lead him to the Philistines and hand him over. But as they're doing this, we're told that the ropes were on his arms. They became as flax as caught fire. And his bonds melted off his hands, and he found a fresh jawbone of a donkey and put out his hand and took it. And with it struck down 1,000 men, 1,000 Philistine men. So think about that, because if Samson's story ended here, it might be, on one level, a tale of triumph. I mean, he's just killed 1,000 Philistines with a fresh donkey bone. End of the story, right? But the story's not over. Because he thought his fatal flaws of romance and revenge were dealt with. But his lust had not been dealt with. It had just been buried and was about to make yet another mistake. We're told at the beginning of chapter 16 that Samson went down to Gaza, and there he saw a prostitute. And his 7th mistake was that he couldn't control his lusts. So those lusts had such a strong hold on him that they were controlling him. His old demons, they were alive and well and waiting once again to bring him his demise. Verse 2 says the Gazites were told, Samson has come here. And they surrounded the place, and they set an ambush for him all night at the gate of the city. They kept quiet all night, saying, let's wait until the light of the morning, then we will kill him. And in one night, it all came crashing down for him. I mean, you can call it a midlife crisis, you can call it whatever you want, but Samson had never really dealt with his old problems, and here they were manifesting themselves again. The Philistines, they hated him. And there was no way that he could just arrive in the city and not be noticed. And they likely had a contract out on his head, and now he is in their capital city. He was again where he shouldn't be, and he was again with someone that he shouldn't be with. His 8th mistake was that he was arrogant, and we're told that Samson got up in the middle of the night and snuck out of the house. On his way out of town, he rips out the doors of the city gates. I mean, picture that. He puts them on his shoulders and he carries them to the top of the hill that faces Hebron. Scholars tell us that these doors likely would have weighed between 700 and 800 pounds. And by carrying off the doors of the city gate, Samson was humiliating the Philistines. I mean, Gaza, if you can picture this, it was surrounded by this thick wall, which meant the gate was the only entrance into the city. And that gate symbolized something. It symbolized safety and security. And for Samson to take away the gate and to carry it away was his way of saying, not only can you not catch me, but I'm going to destroy your symbol of security. And he was arrogant. And he carried the door and put them on the top of the hill which faces Hebron in the land of Judah. And that's where the Israelites were. And he put it up there to say, I can do anything I want and you can't stop me. He's arrogant and he's feeling invincible. And in verse 4, we read this. After this, he loved a woman in the valley of Shorek, whose name was Delilah. And his ninth mistake was a total lack of discernment. Here we are again, getting involved with another wrong relationship and giving in to temptation. I mean, this was the third woman that he had gotten in trouble with, and all three times it was a Palestine woman. His 10th mistake was believing that he could play with that temptation. And the Philistine rulers who knew all about this fatal flaw of his, they came up with a plan. The Philistine governors, as we're told, each offered Delilah 1,100 shekels of silver if she could lure him into showing the secret of his strength. In those days, the average person earned 10 shekels of silver a year. So Delilah, she was about to become a multi-millionaire. The choice between Samson and silver had been already made in her heart. It's interesting. Did you know that the name Delilah actually means weakness? You know, Delilah agrees to trick him into revealing the secret to his strength. And Samson toys with her 3 times. But each time he gets closer and closer and closer to telling her the truth. He thinks he's invincible, and he believes that he's strong enough to play with the temptation. His 11th mistake is his pride. He finally reveals the secret in order to save face. And the passage goes on to tell us this, starting in verse 16. And when she pressed him hard with her words day after day and urged him, his soul was vexed to death. And he told her all his heart and said to her, a razor has never come upon my head, for I have been a Nazirite to God from my mother's womb. If my head is shaved, then my strength will leave me and I shall become weak and be like any other man. So Delilah, she had what she wanted, and she was about to become a very wealthy woman. After Samson told her everything, the rulers of the Philistines came with the silver shekels in their hands. As the story goes, she puts him to sleep on her lap, and he doesn't have a clue what is about to happen. And you know, of all the mistakes that Samson has made, number 12 is likely the most painful. Because Samson didn't realize what he had done until it was too late. And as soon as he's sound asleep, she calls in a man to hack off Samson's hair. And verse 9 says it plainly, his strength left him. And she said in verse 20, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. And he awoke from his sleep and said, I will go out as at other times and shake myself free. But he did not know that the Lord had left him. You know, that last phrase of verse 20, I think, is one of the saddest statements in the whole Old Testament. Just think about that. He did not know that the Lord had left him. He was so far gone that he didn't even realize that the Spirit of the Lord had left him. I think that too many Christians tend to drift away from God, and they don't even realize what they've done until it's too late. They don't appreciate what they had until it's left. And sin will always take you further than you want to go. There's no other way to put this, but what happens next to Samson is ugly. The Philistines have been waiting for 20 years to get their revenge, 20 years of humiliation, and finally they have him. And in verse 21, we're told, then the Philistines seized him. They gouged out his eyes and took him down to Gaza, binding him with bronze shackles, not with rope, but with bronze shackles. And they set him to grinding grain in prison. But you know, thankfully, the story doesn't end there, because Samson still hasn't fulfilled his purpose, right? We're told in verse 22 that the hair of his head began to grow again after it had been shaved. And it was what the Philistines thought was their moment of triumph, that God fulfilled the promise. He had a mission that he was to do, to lead in delivering Israel from the hands of the Philistines. That was Samson's assignment that was given to him even before he was born. And that was about to happen. We're told that the Philistines, they were praising their gods for giving them this great victory, as they were thanking their gods for delivering Samson into their hands, and as they were thanking their gods for protecting them from Samson. It was at that moment that God was going to fulfill Samson's ultimate purpose. We're told that they were having this great celebration, and verse 25 says, when their hearts were merry, they said, call Samson, that he may entertain us. So they pulled him from his prison cell. We're told, so they called Samson out of prison, and he entertained them. They made him stand between the pillars, and Samson said to the young man who held him by his hand, let me feel the pillars on which this house rests, that I may lean against them. Now the house was full of men and women. All the lords of the Philistines were there. And on the roof there were about 3,000 men and women who looked on while Samson entertained. And it was then that Samson did something that showed just how much he had changed. He humbly came before the Lord, and this is what he said. He said, O Lord, please remember me and please strengthen me only this one last time. And that little phrase is so interesting. We translate it as being remember me. But in the Hebrew, it's a verb that we would pronounce as zekar. And when Scripture uses that word, when Scripture speaks of God remembering someone, it doesn't mean that God had forgotten about them. When God remembers, it means that he's acting according to his covenant purpose. So when Samson is saying, remember me, he isn't saying, God, I hope you haven't forgotten me. I hope you haven't forgotten that I exist. But he's saying, Lord, act according to your mercy and to your ultimate covenant purpose. And the story concludes with these words. Then Samson reached towards the two central pillars on which the temple stood, bracing himself against them. his right hand on the one and his left hand on the other. Samson said, "Let me die with the Philistines." And he pushed with all his might, and down came the temple on the rulers and all the people in it. Thus he killed many more when he died than while he lived. I want you to take a look at this list of mistakes and tell me, does this guy sound like someone who has an unshakable faith? You know, the interesting thing about this story is that you might be sitting there thinking, well, Samson never really did fulfill his purpose, did he? I mean, he never did lead the way in delivering Israel from the hands of the Philistines. And actually, his actions that day did. Because God in his sovereignty used Samson to fulfill his purpose. And Samson's death that day, remember, along with the 3,000 plus people who were in that temple, most of whom were the Palestine, or the military generals, most the higher up government officials and leaders, most of the religious leaders. Losing all of those people impeded them to the point where years after it was a major factor in their downfall. If you want to read a fascinating story this afternoon, go to 1 Samuel 7, verses 7 to 14. And you will learn that it was that day and what Samson did that this people group never recovered from that. So tell me, is Samson someone whose faith is an example you want to emulate? I mean, why would he in this story, why would he make this great list of those people in Hebrews 11? Why would God include Samson in this list? And I want to propose to you, it's because Hebrews is not celebrating Samson's perfection. It's celebrating his faith, his moment of faith. The writer of Hebrews says that weakness can be made strong. And that little phrase is particularly important. And it's referring to something that we need to grasp. Because if there was ever a man who could illustrate that one sentence, it was him. It doesn't say that he's not strong despite weakness. It says he's strong through weakness. And here's the paradox of Samson. The strongest man in Israel had to become weak before he learned where his true strength came from. He had to lose his eyes literally before he could truly see. You know, he had to lose his freedom before he learned dependence. He had to lose his reputation before he discovered humility. And he had to lose his strength before he learned to ask God for true strength. Perhaps that's why Samson belongs in Hebrews 11. Because faith doesn't mean that we never become weak. Faith means that we learn to go where to go when we are weak. Let's pray. Lord, I wonder this morning if there's anybody here who